Hello everyone. I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. Story 1. The breathing under my bed. When I was a child, I used to sleep with my mattress pushed into the corner of my room, wedged tightly between two walls. There was something comforting about having those walls on either side, like they protected me from whatever darkness lingered just outside the circle of light from my nightstand lamp. My parents always told me monsters weren't real, that the things I thought I heard were just the creaks and sighs of an old house settling into the night, and for the most part I believed them. But there was one night, one sound, that changed that belief forever. It wasn't dramatic or bloody or loud. It was subtle, quiet, repetitive, and I will never forget it. I had just turned 10, and it was the beginning of summer. My parents let me stay up later than usual, and I remember reading a comic book under the covers with a flashlight, savoring the last minutes before I knew sleep would take me. Eventually, I turned off the lamp, clicked off the flashlight, and nestled into the safety of my bed. The room was quiet. My window was open, letting in the soft sounds of wind through trees and the distant hum of crickets. It was peaceful. But just as I began to drift, I heard it. A breath, not my own, not the kind of soft shifting a house makes, but a distinct, slow inhale and exhale. It came from beneath the bed. At first I thought maybe I was imagining things. I held my own breath to listen better, and there it was again. Inhale, exhale, shaky, as if someone was trying not to be heard. My body froze. Every instinct I had screamed not to move, not to make a sound. I stayed perfectly still, eyes widened out and heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped animal. I wanted to call for my parents, but I was scared that speaking would let whatever it was know that I was awake. So I waited. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I don't know, but the breathing continued. Steady, quiet, waiting. Eventually, I gathered the courage to flip on my bedside lamp. As soon as the light came on, the sound stopped, instantly, like it had never been there. I waited again, holding my breath, ears straining. Nothing. I leaned over the side of the bed, slowly, heart thudding in my throat, and peered underneath. Nothing but dust and a few scattered toys. I grabbed my flashlight and checked again. Still nothing. But the feeling, the cold, prickling sensation crawling over my skin didn't go away. I ended up sleeping on the couch that night, telling my parents I had a bad dream. They didn't ask questions. They just nodded and tucked a blanket around me. I didn't tell them about the breathing. I didn't want them to laugh. The next night, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe I had been half asleep. Maybe I was dreaming with my eyes open. But just in case, I moved my bed slightly away from the wall, leaving a narrow gap underneath, too tight for anything, or anyone, to hide in. I turned off the lights, wrapped myself tightly in my blanket, and waited. For a while, all was calm. The usual nighttime sounds filled the room. But then, just as I began to relax, it started again. The breathing. Slow, deep, controlled, coming from the side now, from that tiny gap between the bed and the wall. This time it was closer than before. I remember slowly turning my head toward the wall, as if I could see through it, as if that would help me understand what was happening. But there was nothing to see, just the wall, and the narrow shadow of space I had deliberately created. The breathing continued. I could even feel a slight change in air pressure, as though whatever was there was real and taking up space. This time I didn't turn on the light. I just lay there, eyes wide open, whispering silently to myself that morning would come, that if I didn't move, it couldn't reach me. And eventually the sound faded, just like before, as though it had lost interest or found a better hiding place. In the days that followed, I began noticing other things. My toys would shift positions while I was at school. Drawers would be slightly open that I had shut. My closet door, normally latched, would be cracked when I got home. My parents blamed it on forgetfulness. I tried to believe them, but deep down I knew something else was going on. I even tried setting a small camera on a shelf one night, using an old camcorder we had. But in the morning, the camera was on the floor, battery drained. Nothing recorded, no answers. This continued off and on for months. Never violent, never escalating beyond sound and presence, but always there. A breath in the dark, a whisper of movement beneath the bed. I became used to it, in a strange way, like the presence had claimed that space and I was simply living around it. It never harmed me, but it never left. Eventually we moved houses, and I told myself it wouldn't follow, but that final night in my old room, I sat in the middle of the floor, whispering to the dark under my bed, "You can't come with me. You have to stay here." I don't know why I said it. It just felt necessary. Now, as an adult, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, certain that I hear that same slow breathing. Not every night, just now and then, when the house is especially still, when my dreams are particularly deep, and every time I check, I look under the bed, behind the curtains, inside the closet, always finding nothing. But still I wonder, because once you've heard a sound that doesn't belong, once you've shared a room with something you can't see but can feel, you never forget it, and you never fully sleep in silence again. Story 2. The Night Visitor at the Farmhouse Window. Years ago, I spent a summer with my uncle on his farm in the countryside, far from the noise of cities and streetlights. It was the kind of place where the stars blanketed the sky in thick constellations, and the nights were so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat if you sat still long enough. The farmhouse was old, built in the 1930s, and though it had charm, it also had creaks and groans that whispered through the wood at all hours. My uncle had warned me not to be spooked. "Old houses breathe," he said. "They talk a little at night." I nodded, pretending to be brave, but deep down I was always a little on edge once the sun went down. I slept in a small upstairs bedroom with a slanted ceiling and a window that looked out over the vast cornfield behind the house. The field stretched for what felt like miles, rows upon rows of green stalks, tall and rustling like whispers when the wind picked up. There were no streetlights, no neighbors nearby, just black sky and moonlight. During the day it felt peaceful. At night, that same emptiness turned heavy, like the darkness itself was watching. One night, maybe 3 weeks into my stay, I woke up suddenly around 2 a.m. Not to a sound, not to a nightmare. Just woke up fully alert, like something had nudged me from sleep. I lay still for a moment, trying to figure out what was off. Then I noticed something. The room was cold, colder than usual. The kind of chill that seeps into your bones. I looked toward the window and realized it was wide open. I was sure I had closed it before bed. I always did. It didn't have a screen and bugs would get in if left open. But now it was open, and the curtains were fluttering softly in the breeze. I sat up slowly, listening, and then I saw it. A face, not pressed to the glass, just beyond the frame, partly obscured by the curtains, pale, motionless, watching me. For a moment I couldn't even scream. My voice locked in my throat as my eyes adjusted. The face didn't move. It was expressionless, not angry or smiling, just blank. The eyes were dark, almost too dark to see the whites. The mouth was closed, thin lips tight like someone holding their breath. I scrambled backward on the bed, nearly falling off the edge. That movement must have triggered something, because the face slowly pulled away, melting back into the shadows. I rushed to the window, slammed it shut, and locked it with trembling hands. Then I pulled the curtains closed and backed away, heart racing like a drum. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat on the bed with the lamp on, waiting for dawn. The next morning I told my uncle what I had seen. He paused, fork halfway to his mouth, and looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something I'll never forget. "You're not the first to see someone at that window," he said. "Your aunt used to say the same thing, back before she passed. Thought someone came every summer, around this time." I stared at him, shocked, but he didn't elaborate. Just went back to eating his eggs. That was his way. Practical, unshaken. But that didn't calm me. It made things worse, because if I was imagining it, I could dismiss it. But if others had seen the same face, the same figure, year after year, what did that mean? That night, I double-checked the window before bed. Locked, secured, curtains drawn tight. I even moved a heavy chair in front of it, just in case. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house made my muscles tense. Every groan of the wind felt like a whisper aimed at me. Still, hours passed and nothing happened. No face, no cold breeze, just silence. I finally drifted off sometime after 3 a.m. and woke up late the next morning. Relieved. Maybe it had been a one-time thing. Maybe I'd imagined it. On the outside of the window, pressed into the glass, were handprints. 2 of them, smudged but unmistakable, as though someone had leaned forward, palms flat on the pane, watching me from inches away. The glass was cold to the touch. I called my uncle, who came upstairs and inspected the window with a solemn face. "Same as last year," he muttered under his breath. Then, louder, to me, "Don't worry, they never get inside." I didn't find that reassuring. In fact, the idea that they came back every year was more horrifying than any alternative. My uncle refused to speak more about it, said I should let it be. For the rest of the summer, I slept downstairs on the couch, closer to the front door, further from that window. I never saw the face again, but I always felt it, just beyond the house, just outside the walls, watching, waiting. Sometimes I'd wake up with the sensation of being stared at. Other times I'd hear soft scratching at the glass, so faint I wasn't sure if it was real or just my tired brain playing tricks. But I never went to the window to look again. I didn't want to see it twice. Once was enough to change the way I looked at the dark. Years have passed since that summer. My uncle has since sold the farm and moved into town. The old house sits empty now, boarded up and overgrown. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that window. I think about what might still be standing outside, watching through the cracked panes, waiting for someone else to sleep upstairs again, and I wonder if, somewhere in the tall corn beyond the edge of the field, that blank face still lingers, waiting for the window to open once more. Story 3. The eyes that watched me sleep. I used to rent a small apartment on the 3rd floor of an old Victorian building that had been converted into separate units. The place was charming in its own way. Creaky floors, high ceilings, and arched windows that caught the morning light just right. I lived alone, and the quiet was something I'd grown to love. Most nights I'd light a candle, make tea, and read a book until my eyes got heavy enough to drift into sleep. The building was mostly occupied by elderly tenants, the kind who rarely left their apartments, except for groceries or doctor visits. It made the halls feel deserted at times, but I never minded. I enjoyed the solitude, or at least I used to. My bedroom faced a narrow alleyway between buildings, and the window was large, spanning most of the wall. It didn't offer much of a view, just a brick wall and a few garbage bins, but I liked to keep the blinds half open to let in the moonlight. I figured no one could see in from that side anyway. The alley was barely wide enough for a person to walk through. It was secluded, boxed in by buildings, and almost always empty. At night, it was especially quiet. That kind of quiet where even the softest creak feels amplified, where the sound of your own breathing becomes a constant presence in your ears. That's when the feeling began, subtle at first but impossible to ignore. It started with the sense of being watched. You know that strange, crawling feeling on the back of your neck, the one that makes you glance over your shoulder even when you're alone? That feeling visited me every night for a week straight. At first I chalked it up to anxiety, or maybe just my imagination running wild, but it only happened in the bedroom, and only when I was lying in bed, half awake, with my face turned toward the window. Eventually I started keeping the blinds fully shut, trying to block out whatever invisible gaze I thought I was sensing, but that didn't help. In fact, it made it worse. One night, I had a dream, or at least I thought it was a dream, where I woke up and saw someone standing outside my window. They weren't doing anything, just standing. Their face was obscured, but I could make out the outline, a head, shoulders, and the glint of two eyes catching the moonlight. In the dream I sat up, heart pounding, but couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just watched as the figure stared through the glass. Then I truly woke up, drenched in sweat, the feeling still clinging to me like fog. I rushed to the window and yanked open the blinds. The alley was empty. Of course it was, but the unease didn't go away. That morning I noticed something odd. On the outside of the window pane were streaks, thin vertical lines, as though fingers had been dragged down the glass. I stood there staring at them for a long time, unsure whether they were from condensation or something else. I opened the window, reached out, and tried to wipe them off, but they didn't budge. I had to scrub with glass cleaner before they faded. That should have been enough to move out, but I stayed. Mostly because I didn't have anywhere else to go, and partly because a part of me didn't want to believe anything strange was happening. I told myself it was just the wind, or leftover smudges from previous tenants. But then came the night I woke up to the sound of tapping. Not the usual settling noises or the clanging of old pipes, but sharp, rhythmic tapping on the window. 3 taps. Pause. Then 3 more. I sat upright in bed, pulse racing. The room was dimly lit by a streetlight down the alley, and the blinds were closed, but I could see their silhouette moving. Someone was out there. I froze, not sure if I should call the police or even move. After what felt like hours, the tapping stopped. I waited another 10 minutes before daring to peek through the blinds. The alley was empty. Not even a shadow remained. That was the last straw. I filed a report with the building manager the next morning. He didn't seem surprised. In fact, his exact words were, "It happens sometimes in old buildings like this." I pressed him for more, but he just shrugged. I started keeping a knife beside my bed, not because I thought it would help, but because it made me feel less helpless. I stopped sleeping properly. Every creak, every gust of wind, every shifting shadow became a threat, and every night, I woke up feeling like something was just outside my window, waiting patiently, staring in with eyes that never blinked. Eventually, I set up a camera facing the window. I wanted proof, something to show the manager, something to tell me I wasn't going mad. I let it run overnight and checked the footage the next morning. Nothing unusual at first. Just me turning in my sleep, blanket rising and falling with each breath. But around 3:12 a.m., the frame flickered for just 2 seconds. A face, close to the glass, expressionless, staring directly into the lens. No sound, no tapping, just watching, then gone. The rest of the footage was normal. I deleted the file. I couldn't watch it again. I moved out a week later, broke my lease and left most of my things behind. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I still don't know what it was. A stranger. A dream bleeding into reality. Something else entirely. All I know is that something stood at my window night after night, waiting patiently, never speaking, never forcing its way in, but never leaving either. And now, no matter where I live, I sleep with the blinds shut tight and furniture pushed against the glass. Because once you've been watched by something that has no name, sleep never feels safe again. Story 4. The Forgotten Road in the Fog. There's a stretch of road just outside my hometown that no one talks about anymore. It used to be the main route connecting our little town to the next, winding through dense woods and low-lying marshes, always just a little darker than it should be even in daylight. People called it Hollow Mile. Years ago, it was busy, cars, buses, people moving from one place to another. But strange things started happening. And little by little, the traffic thinned until no one drove that road unless they absolutely had to. Eventually, a new highway was built, and Hollow Mile was left to decay, forgotten beneath a blanket of vines, moss, and silence. When I was 17, I made the mistake of driving that road alone one foggy evening. I had just finished a late shift at the diner and decided to take a shortcut home. The main road was closed for repairs, and I figured cutting through Hollow Mile would save me at least 20 minutes. I hadn't been on that road in years, not since I was a kid riding in the back seat, too young to understand why adults always went quiet while driving it. That night, the fog was thicker than I'd ever seen. It rolled in like a living thing, swallowing the headlights, muffling every sound but the tires crunching on gravel and the hum of the engine. As soon as I turned onto the road, everything changed. The trees looked darker, the air colder, the fog unnaturally still. There were no signs, no markers, no way to tell how far I had gone or how much farther I had to go, just a narrow road stretching forward into nothingness. I turned off the radio because the static was unbearable and grating in the thick silence. That's when I noticed the sound. Faint at first, like someone whispering in the back seat. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw nothing but fog. I turned around quickly. Still nothing. Just the empty seats and my own reflection staring back at me in the glass. Trying to calm myself, I rolled down the window a bit, thinking fresh air might help. But the moment the glass lowered, the whispering grew louder. It didn't sound like words, just soft breath and broken sounds, like someone trying to speak through water. I rolled the window back up in panic, gripping the steering wheel tighter, heart racing. The fog got thicker, wrapping around the car like a blanket. I slowed down to a crawl, headlights useless now, illuminating only a few feet ahead. I was too afraid to stop but too blind to drive fast. That's when I saw the figure standing in the road. At first I thought it was an animal. A deer maybe. But as I approached, I realized it was a person. A man. He was barefoot, wearing clothes that looked soaked through, hanging heavy on his frame. He didn't move, didn't look at the car. He just stood there in the middle of the lane, head slightly bowed, arms limp at his sides. I slammed on the brakes and came to a stop just feet away. My breath fogged up the windshield as I stared, unsure what to do. Honk? Reverse? Call for help? I reached for my phone, but of course there was no signal. Not in Hollow Mile. Nile. Suddenly the figure turned and began to walk slowly into the woods, vanishing into the mist. Without thinking, I followed with my eyes, but couldn't see where he went. The fog swallowed him whole. I waited a minute, maybe two, heart pounding in my chest. Then I pressed the gas and moved forward, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. A few yards ahead, the fog thinned slightly, and I saw something that made my stomach drop. A second figure, identical to the first, same soaked clothes, same bowed head, standing in the exact middle of the road. I blinked, and they were gone. Just gone. I began to cry. Not from fear exactly, but from the crushing weight of unreality. I knew I was still on the road, still in my car. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't in the same world anymore. Like Hollow Mile, I'd shifted into a space all its own, where time paused and sound meant nothing. I pressed forward, barely breathing, barely blinking, praying for the road to end. And finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the edge of the fog break and the outlines of familiar trees emerge. I pulled over as soon as I reached the main road and sat there in the car for what must have been 20 minutes, unable to speak or move. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone what I saw, but the next morning I checked the news, and there was a small article about a missing man last seen walking along Hollow Mile. No one had found him. No trace. Just gone. That stretch of road has since been completely barricaded. Trees have grown through the pavement. Nature has swallowed it whole. But sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick and low, people swear they hear footsteps or see shadows moving behind the mist, and a few still whisper that Hollow Mile doesn't just take you across town, it takes you somewhere else entirely, somewhere you're not supposed to return from. Story 5. The locked door at the end of the hall. When I was in college, I rented a room in an old, run-down house that had been converted into a student boarding home. It was cheap, and the location was perfect, close to campus, close to the coffee shop where I worked, and within walking distance of everything I needed. The house was enormous, 4 stories high, and probably beautiful at one time, but now it was just tired, peeling wallpaper, flickering lights, a constant draft no matter the season. My room was on the 3rd floor, and despite the creaks and quirks, it suited me. There were 6 of us living there, strangers turned roommates, each with a locked door, a shared kitchen, and a silent understanding that privacy was respected. All of us agreed, however, that the one door at the very end of the hallway was different. That door was always locked. It didn't belong to any of the tenants, and none of us had a key. It looked older than the others, solid oak with a tarnished brass knob and a strange, faded symbol carved into the center. At first, we all assumed it was a maintenance closet or storage room, until someone tried the knob and realized it didn't even rattle. The landlord, Mr. Crenshaw, brushed it off when asked, saying it had been sealed off years ago due to structural damage. "Just don't worry about it," he said, smiling too quickly. "That part of the house isn't used anymore. We left it at that. Mostly." But we all felt the same pull toward it, like something waited behind it, silent and listening. It wasn't until the second month that things started to get strange. At night we began hearing noises, soft thuds, like furniture being dragged across the floor. Sometimes muffled voices, too low to make out. The sounds always came from the direction of the locked door. One night I was walking down the hall to use the bathroom when I heard a faint tapping. Tap, tap, from behind the door. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. It didn't sound accidental. It was too slow, too deliberate. I backed away without breathing, heart pounding in my ears. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been the wind, but the hallway had no windows. One of the other tenants, a guy named Marcus, became obsessed. He started placing his ear against the door, listening for hours. He swore he could hear breathing. "There's someone in there," he whispered to me once, eyes wild with certainty. Not something. Someone. Waiting. I laughed nervously, hoping he was just messing with me, but his face was too serious. A week later, Marcus moved out without telling anyone, left all his stuff behind. We found his room empty, bed made, lights off, no note. The landlord didn't seem surprised. He simply shook his head and said, "It happens sometimes." That's when the rest of us started locking our doors at night. Then came the night the door was open. I woke up to a creaking sound, the kind old houses make when someone walks across a loose floorboard. I sat up in bed, listening. Another creak, closer this time. I opened my door a crack and peeked into the hallway. The door at the end was wide open. The darkness beyond it was absolute, like light had no permission to exist in that space. The symbol on the wood glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. I stepped out, despite every instinct screaming not to, and walked toward it slowly. I wasn't in control. I just moved. The hallway seemed to stretch longer with each step. The shadows danced. The temperature dropped. I stood at the threshold and looked inside. It was a room, but it didn't feel like one. The walls were too tall. The ceiling vanished into darkness, and in the center was a chair, old and wooden, facing away from me. I didn't see anyone sitting there, but I knew someone was. I could feel their gaze before I even stepped in. I don't remember closing the door, but when I blinked, I was back in my bed, heart racing, sweat clinging to my skin. The door at the end of the hall was shut again, just like it had always been. The next morning, I asked around. No one else had heard anything. No one else had seen the door open. I started to wonder if I had dreamt the whole thing, if my mind had made it up. But then I noticed something new. A long scratch across the door, deep and fresh, as if something inside had clawed to get out. After that, I kept my distance. I walked a long way around the hallway, even if it meant wasting time, but the sounds continued. Some nights it was the hair creaking. Other nights, the sound of soft footsteps pacing back and forth, always behind that door. By the end of the semester, 3 more tenants had left without notice, their rooms untouched, their belongings untouched. The landlord never gave an explanation, just shrugged and smiled that same forced smile. I moved out the day after finals. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I packed in silence, kept my head down, and refused to glance down the hallway as I left. But in the back of my mind, I still wonder about that room. I wonder if it ever truly locked. I wonder what would have happened if I had stepped inside. And most of all, I wonder why, after all this time, I still dream about that chair turning slowly toward me. Story 6. The forest that doesn't let you leave. In the quiet hills outside a small mountain town, there's a forest that locals never enter after dark. It's not marked on any official maps, and no trails run through it. The trees are tall, ancient, and gnarled, and they seem to lean in toward each other, like conspirators whispering secrets. When I moved into the town to take a seasonal job at the ranger station, I didn't think much of the warnings. People in rural areas always had their myths, and I figured the forest was just another story to keep kids from wandering too far. But something about the way people avoided it, even in daylight, began to gnaw at me. It started with stories from the older rangers. They told me not to go past the stone marker, a moss-covered pillar deep along the east border. It's not the trees, they'd say. It's what walks between them. I laughed it off at first. After all, I'd hiked that region dozens of times during my training. But every time I approached that section of forest, my compass would spin, and the air would shift, still and heavy, like something ancient was holding its breath. Animals wouldn't go near it. Even the birds fell silent when I stepped too close. I once heard my own footsteps echoing back at me from the wrong direction. Despite the warnings, curiosity got the better of me. One afternoon, just before dusk, I packed light and decided to hike in a straight line through the forest. I told myself I'd go no more than a mile and mark my path with chalk on the trees. The deeper I went, the more the world around me seemed to blur. The sun, though still above the horizon, barely pierced the canopy. A dull grey light replaced the warmth of day. I checked my watch. Only 30 minutes had passed, but it felt like hours. Then I saw it, the stone marker, tall and narrow, like a crude headstone, standing alone among the roots. The moment I stepped past it, everything changed. My chalk marks disappeared, literally vanished. I turned around and saw no trace of my trail. Every tree looked the same, bark grey with twisted branches that all leaned slightly inward. I spun in place, trying to reorient myself, but the forest was different now. It wasn't just quiet, it was void. No wind, no birds, just the sound of my own breath and the rising panic in my chest. I pulled out my compass. The needle spun wildly in circles. I turned on my GPS. No signal. I should have turned back then, but I couldn't tell which way was back anymore. I started walking in what I thought was the right direction. I walked for what felt like another hour, but the trees never changed. No slope in the land, no clearings, no distant mountain peaks or familiar ridges. It was like walking in a painting that kept repainting itself around me. Then I saw movement ahead, a figure, just a glimpse, a silhouette between the trees. Human-shaped but too tall. I froze, heart hammering. It didn't move like a person. Its limbs were long and slightly crooked, like its joints bent in the wrong places. I backed away, never taking my eyes off where I'd seen it. But when I blinked, it was gone. From then on, I wasn't alone. I didn't hear it or see it clearly again, but I felt it. Every time I stopped walking, I could sense it getting closer. If I listened hard enough, I could hear faint breathing, not mine, coming from behind the nearest tree. I started running, crashing through brush, ducking under branches, heart pounding like a drum. But no matter how far I ran, the forest stayed the same. The same grey trees, the same twisted roots, the same silence. At one point I screamed just to hear my own voice. When exhaustion took over, I collapsed at the base of a tree and closed my eyes. I don't remember falling asleep. But when I opened them, it was morning. Light filtered through the branches, soft and golden. The forest no longer looked quite as dark. I stood up, confused and shaky, and walked a few paces, and found myself on a trail, a real, maintained trail, with signs and wooden posts. Somehow I had made it out. A group of hikers found me shortly after, and I played it off as getting lost on an off-map detour. But deep down I knew the forest had let me go. Not because I escaped, but because it decided to release me. Back at the station, I checked the GPS tracker embedded in my gear. It showed nothing, just a long unbroken signal that ended at the edge of the forest where I had entered. Everything beyond that point blank, wiped clean. I asked one of the older rangers about it, the one who had warned me in the first place. He looked at me for a long time and simply said, "You're lucky. Most don't come back." He wouldn't say anything more. But I didn't need him to. I already knew. Something lives in that forest. Something that watches and waits and chooses. I never went near it again. I finished out my seasonal job and moved to another region altogether. But even now, years later, I still dream of it. The endless grey trees, the soundless air, the crooked figure behind the trunks, and I always wake up with dirt under my nails, like I've been crawling through roots and soil. I've learned not to question it. I've learned to let the memory sit quietly. But if you ever find yourself near a forest with no name, a place too quiet, too still, do not go in. Some paths don't lead you back. Some woods remember your scent. Story 7. The thing in my wall. I moved into the old duplex on a whim, needing a place quickly after a sudden job transfer, and breakup left me searching. The place was small but had character. Worn hardwood floors, old radiators, and those tall windows with frames thick enough to sit on. It felt lived in, but in a good way, like the ghosts of people before me had been mostly kind. The landlord was an older man who seemed relieved just to have someone fill the unit. "It's quiet," he said. "Nothing much happens around here." That was true. For a while, quiet, uneventful, until the scratching started in the wall behind my bed. At first I thought it was mice. The building was old, and even clean places have pests now and then, but the sound wasn't scurrying. It was deliberate. A slow, drawn-out scrape, then a pause, then another scrape, as though someone, or something, was dragging nails or claws just beneath the surface of the plaster. I moved my bed away from the wall and tried not to think about it. I even bought earplugs, but the sound didn't go away. It moved. One night it was above my head. The next, beneath the floor. It followed me, always just behind or beneath whatever room I was in. Always scratching, always patient. Eventually I called pest control. A young guy came in, knocked on the walls, checked the vents. "Doesn't look like rats," he said. "And no droppings either. You sure it's not the pipes?" I told him it didn't happen with water running. He shrugged and promised to lay some traps anyway. I never heard anything get caught. But the scratching grew louder, and then it started to happen at night. Always after 2 a.m. Sometimes it would wake me up, not just from the sound, but from a sense, like something was aware of me, watching me through the walls, listening to my breathing, my shifting in bed, my thoughts. One night I pressed my ear to the wall, foolish and half asleep. I expected the scratch, but instead, I heard breathing. Deep, slow, measured, and then a voice low, almost a whisper, so faint I couldn't make out the words, only the cadence, the shape of something speaking without breath. I fell backward, heart pounding, scrambling across the floor like a child afraid of the dark. I didn't sleep that night. And from that moment on I stopped being alone in the apartment. Even when the rooms were empty, I felt the presence. In the silence, in the coolness of the air, in the stillness that never felt entirely still. I tried to ignore it. I filled my time. Work, podcasts, phone calls, anything to drown out the silence. But the thing in the wall wasn't subtle anymore. I began to see changes, small ones, cracks forming in places I hadn't noticed before. A dark smudge appearing near the light switch. Once, I found all my kitchen cabinets open when I returned from work. Every single one, as if someone had walked through them looking for something. I asked the landlord if anyone had access to my unit. He said no. I asked about the previous tenant. He just said she left in a hurry. Wouldn't say why. Then came the dreams. Vivid, colorless dreams of narrow corridors and pulsing walls. In those dreams, I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I was in the space behind it, the space within the walls. Everything was slightly too narrow, the doors too small, the air stale, thick, humming with a sound I couldn't trace. And always in the corner of the dream was a figure, tall, thin, skin like paper stretched tight across bone, watching. I'd wake up gasping, the scent of dust and mold thick in my nose, even though my room smelled normal by day, and each time, the cracks in the walls seemed a little wider. Desperate, I bought a small hammer and began tapping the wall behind my bed, listening for hollows. One night I found one, a section that sounded different, deeper. I marked it and waited. The next evening, I took the hammer and gently cracked open the drywall. It broke apart easier than I thought it would. Behind it was a cavity. Not insulation. Not wiring. Just space. I pulled out more and shone a flashlight inside. What I saw turned my stomach. Scratch marks. Deep gouges etched into the wood. Some were old. Others looked fresh. Beneath them, a small bundle of what looked like cloth or hair. I sealed the wall back up that night. I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch with every light on and watched the hallway like something might crawl out of it. The next morning I packed a bag and left. I didn't even give notice. I drove to a hotel and stayed there for 2 weeks before finding a new place, far from that part of town. I never went back for my things. I don't know who or what lives in that wall, whether it was ever human, whether it wanted something, or if it was just watching, waiting. And sometimes when I'm alone and the room is too quiet, I hear it again, just a faint scratch behind the plaster, like it found me again, and is trying to remind me I was never really alone. Story 8. The reflection that wasn't me. When I first moved into the apartment, I loved the mirror above the fireplace. It was large, with an ornate silver frame that looked like it belonged in a museum. The previous tenant had left it behind, and the landlord told me it had been there for years, bolted into the wall. The glass had that old, warped look around the edges, slightly darkened, like time had soaked into it. I didn't mind. It gave the place character, and for the first few weeks, I hardly noticed it beyond the occasional glance as I passed through the living room. But then, something about my reflection started to feel wrong. It was subtle at first. I'd catch my reflection looking just a fraction of a second too slow to follow my movements, like if I raised my hand, the mirrored version of me would hesitate for a heartbeat before copying me. I told myself it was the age of the glass or tricks of the light. But the feeling stuck with me, growing heavier each time I looked. Sometimes, when I turned my head away, I could swear I still saw the reflection watching me from the corner of my eye. And late at night, if I walked past in the dark, I avoided looking altogether. One evening I stood in front of the mirror, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. I stared hard at the reflection, raising one hand, then the other. My reflection mimicked me perfectly. I tilted my head. It did the same. But then, just as I turned to walk away, I caught it. A flicker. My reflection blinked after I already had. I froze, pulse quickening, and slowly turned back. Everything looked normal again. But the unease didn't leave. It sat in my chest like a weight. From that night forward, I started covering the mirror before bed with an old blanket. It made me feel childish, but somehow safer. A week later, I woke up in the middle of the night to a noise, a soft rhythmic tapping. I followed it through the apartment, heart pounding, until I reached the living room. The blanket had fallen off the mirror, or maybe it had been pulled. I don't know. What I do know is that my reflection was standing in the mirror, perfectly still, eyes locked on mine. But I wasn't moving. My hands were at my sides, but in the mirror, they were raised, pressed against the glass like I was trying to get out. I stumbled backward, flipped on the light, and the image snapped back to normal. My reflection moved as it should, but I couldn't shake the feeling I had just interrupted something. From that night on, the mirror became a presence in the apartment. I could feel it from the hallway. The air around it seemed colder, heavier. Objects near it felt displaced, slightly tilted, like gravity behaved differently in that corner. I stopped sitting in the living room, stopped reading there, stopped passing by unless absolutely necessary. I even thought about removing the mirror, but when I examined the bolts, they looked strange, old, rusted, fused to the frame, as if they'd grown into the wall itself. And beneath the edges of the frame, there were symbols etched into the plaster, not decorative, carved. One night, I worked up the nerve to touch the glass, just my fingertips. It was colder than the rest of the room, unnaturally so, and it pulsed faintly beneath my skin, like something alive. I pulled my hand back and saw, for a second, my reflection staring at me with a look I've never worn. Not fear, not confusion. It was pity, deep, knowing pity, like it understood something I didn't, and maybe never would. I stopped using mirrors altogether after that, brushed my teeth in the dark, got dressed without looking. It was easier that way. Safer. But the sense of being watched never left. Eventually, I started hearing whispers in the apartment. Not voices exactly, more like overlapping thoughts just beyond hearing. Like standing in a room full of murmuring people. None of them visible. The sounds were loudest near the fireplace, and sometimes I'd find things moved around. Nothing big, just small objects, a pen on the floor, a book turned upside down, a cup placed perfectly in the center of the rug. It felt like the mirror was trying to get my attention. Or maybe the thing inside it was growing stronger. Either way, I couldn't take it anymore. I reached out to a local antique dealer, asking if they knew anything about the mirror. When they saw a photo, they went pale, said it looked like a watcher's mirror, an old design from European folklore. Supposedly, these mirrors were used in ritual practices, not to reflect ourselves but to serve as windows to what they wouldn't say. But the person warned me not to break it. Never break it, they said. You'll release what's waiting behind it. That night, I nailed the blanket over the mirror and started sleeping with the lights on. The final night I spent in that apartment, I woke up to silence. Not just quiet, total, suffocating silence. No hum from the fridge. No distant city noise. No wind. Just absence. I walked into the living room and saw the blanket torn off the mirror, lying in a perfect square on the floor. My reflection stood facing me, unmoving. But behind it, the room in the mirror was different. It was darker, older, dustier. And standing just behind my reflection was a second figure, taller, cloaked in shadow. As I watched, my reflection slowly turned its head to face it, then turned back to me and smiled. I moved out the next morning, left most of my furniture, just walked away and didn't look back. I don't use mirrors anymore, not real ones. I cover them or avoid them, because sometimes, when you look too long, something looks back, and I don't think it's always you. Story 9. The woman at the window. When I first moved into my new apartment, it felt like a fresh start. It was small but bright, perched on the third floor of an old brick building that overlooked a quiet, tree-lined street. The windows were tall, and the view gave me a sense of openness I hadn't felt in years. I worked from home, which meant I spent long hours at my desk near the window, typing away with the hum of life outside as background music. That window became my favorite part of the place, a source of both light and comfort. At least it was, until I started noticing the woman across the street. Her apartment was directly across from mine, one floor up. I first saw her on a rainy evening, standing completely still in her window. She wore a long, pale nightgown and had dark hair that hung loose around her shoulders. She didn't move. She didn't look around. She just stood there, arms by her side, staring down at the street below. I assumed she was watching the rain or lost in thought, but she was still there hours later, long after nightfall, lit only by a faint yellow lamp in her room. I finally went to bed thinking nothing of it. Maybe she couldn't sleep. Maybe she liked the sound of rain. The next night she was there again, same position, same gown, same unmoving stance. This time I watched her for nearly an hour. She never blinked. She never looked away. I tried to convince myself she was just oddly still, maybe even unaware that people could see her from the street, but something about her presence began to unsettle me. The way she stood, the emptiness in her posture, like she wasn't really seeing anything at all, but merely occupying that space as a placeholder. By the third night, I started closing my blinds. I didn't want to look at her anymore. But even with the blinds closed, I could feel her. It sounds ridiculous, but I began to sense her gaze, like it reached through the glass and settled on my skin. I'd walk past the window and feel a chill. I stopped working near it, stopped opening it for air. One night, curiosity got the better of me and I peeked through the blinds. She was closer to the window now, and this time, she wasn't staring at the street. She was staring directly at my apartment, not scanning the view, not lost in thought. Her head was tilted slightly, and I was certain she was looking right at me. I dropped the blinds quickly and stepped away. I started asking around. A neighbor in the hallway said the unit across the street had been empty for months. No one's been in there since last fall. He told me. He must have seen someone visiting, but I knew better. I saw her every night now, and her presence was no longer passive. I began waking up to strange things. Footsteps on my hardwood floor that didn't belong to me. The sound of soft tapping on my window, even though it was locked. And once, a faint whisper I couldn't understand coming from the corner of my room. I began leaving lights on all night. I stopped sleeping well. Then came the night I saw her inside my apartment. I woke up in a cold sweat and looked toward the living room, and she was there, standing in front of my window, facing outward, her face hidden by the dark curtain of her hair. The nightgown looked more tattered than before. The air was icy cold. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I just watched, paralyzed, as she slowly turned her head, inch by inch, toward me. But before I could see her face, everything went black. I woke up in the morning, still on the couch, heart racing, and the front door was wide open. Nothing had been taken. Nothing was out of place. But I knew something had been there. After that, I stopped staying at the apartment. I crashed on friends' couches, rented hotel rooms, did anything I could to avoid going back. But every time I passed that street, I saw her. Always at the window, always staring. Sometimes she was higher, sometimes lower. Once, I saw her in an entirely different building, but still staring directly at me, like her presence was no longer tied to a single place but to me. Wherever I went, she could follow. That realization hit like ice. I wasn't dealing with a haunted building. I was the one being haunted. Eventually I moved, left the city entirely, found a new place far from anything familiar, in a town where no one knew me and every face was new. The apartment was clean and modern. No creaks, no old mirrors or mysterious corners. But on my second night there, I looked out the window. There, across the street, in a building I hadn't paid much attention to before, stood a figure, pale, still, staring. The same long hair, the same nightgown. I stepped away from the glass slowly, heart pounding. She had found me again. And I understood now she wasn't bound by space. She was bound by recognition. So now, I never open my curtains. I avoid windows whenever possible. I sleep with the lights on and the blinds drawn, because once you see her, really see her, once she knows you've acknowledged her presence, she stays with you. She watches. She waits. And every night I wonder how long it will be before she's not just standing at the window, before she finds her way inside again. Story 10, The Quiet Man in the Hallway. It began shortly after I moved into the old Victorian house that had been split into 3 separate apartments. I rented the top floor, a cozy unit with slanted ceilings and creaky floorboards that echoed my every step. The house had charm, though, and I liked the old woodwork and the tall, narrow windows. My neighbors were quiet. A young couple on the first floor, and an older man on the middle floor whom I never saw. The landlord mentioned he'd lived there for years and mostly kept to himself. I thought nothing of it. I was just grateful for the peace. At night I sometimes heard footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. Slow, measured steps that didn't sound like my younger neighbors. They were too heavy, too deliberate. I figured it was the man downstairs coming home late or pacing when he couldn't sleep. But one night, I stayed up reading, and just past midnight, I heard the footsteps again, coming up the stairs. They stopped right outside my door. I waited, expecting a knock or the creak of someone moving away, but there was nothing, just silence. When I finally opened the door, the hallway was empty, though I could still feel the echo of presence hanging in the air. After that, the footsteps became more frequent. Some nights they stopped outside my door, other times they continued past, fading into the attic stairwell, which no tenant had access to. I asked the landlord if the attic was used for anything, but he just shook his head. Been locked for years, he said. Keys lost. Nothing up there but dust and old boards. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that someone was going up there at night. I placed a small bell on the inside of my door, just for peace of mind. I didn't want anyone sneaking in without me hearing. But some nights, I swore I heard the bell rattle softly, without the door ever opening. One particularly cold night, I stayed up late watching a movie. Inside my apartment, I froze staring at the hallway that led from the front room to the bedroom, and that's when I saw him. A man, tall and thin, wearing a dark coat, standing in the shadows near the bedroom door. He didn't move. He didn't speak. I couldn't see his face, but I felt him looking at me. The air turned cold, heavy, like I was underwater. I blinked, and he was gone. But the silence that followed was louder than any scream. I checked every lock, every window. Nothing was broken. Nothing had been forced. And the bell on the door hadn't moved. I tried to sleep with the lights on, heart pounding, but I couldn't shake the image of the man. His outline burned into my mind, like a shadow that didn't belong to anything real. The next morning I asked my neighbors if they'd ever seen anything unusual. The couple downstairs said no. But the older man on the middle floor surprised me. When I mentioned the footsteps, he looked me dead in the eye and said, "You've seen him too, haven't you?" He told me that the house had once belonged to a widower who lived alone after losing his family in a fire. The attic, he said, had been his refuge. After the fire, the man would pace the halls at night, muttering to himself, haunted by things no one could see. Eventually he disappeared. Just gone. No one knows what happened. The police found nothing. No body. No signs of struggle. But tenants since then had reported the same thing. Footsteps, shadows, cold spots. One even claimed to have spoken with the man, only to find out later the apartment had been empty at the time. The landlord never acknowledged any of it. Too many stories scare off renters, the old man said. I decided to set up a small camera in the hallway, pointing toward the attic stairs. It recorded for a week. Most nights nothing happened, but on the 6th night, I caught something, a figure moving slowly up the stairs. It wasn't clear, flickering like heat distortion, but the shape was unmistakable, tall, slender, the same outline I'd seen before. It paused at the attic door, then turned slightly, as if looking directly into the camera, and then it vanished. Not walked away, vanished, like it had never been there. I didn't sleep after that. I couldn't. I left every light on and kept a baseball bat beside my bed, though I knew it wouldn't help. The next night, I heard my name whispered in the hallway. Not loud, but enough to freeze the blood in my veins. It was slow, careful, like someone testing the weight of each syllable. I opened the door with shaking hands. No one was there, but I saw the attic door slightly ajar, something I had never seen before. I closed and locked my door and decided I'd had enough. The next morning, I packed everything I could and left. The landlord didn't ask questions, just nodded like he'd heard it all before, and maybe he had. I live in a newer building now, no creaks, no history. But some nights, I swear I still hear footsteps, not from neighbors, not from upstairs, but from just beyond the door, careful, deliberate, as though someone still paces, looking for a room that remembers him. And when I look toward the hallway, sometimes I see just the faintest outline of a tall, still figure, waiting. Story 11. The voice in the vents. I had just moved into my new apartment when I first heard the voice. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't clear, but it was there, whispering through the vents late at night. At first I thought it was just the building settling, or air passing through old ducts. I told myself that old buildings make strange noises, and not everything has to mean something, but there was something undeniably human about the sound. Something intentional, like words were being formed just beneath the edge of understanding, floating up from somewhere below the floorboards and traveling through the walls until they found me. My apartment was on the 2nd floor of a 3-story building, and the vents connected all the units, so I assumed it was someone talking late at night, watching TV or on the phone. But what unsettled me was the pattern. It happened every night, always around the same time. Between 2 and 2:30 a.m., the whispers would begin. Faint and irregular, like pieces of a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. Sometimes I could make out syllables, but never words. Just a low, breathy murmur, and whenever I moved closer to the vent to hear better, it would stop completely, like it knew I was listening. Curiosity got the better of me. I knocked on my neighbor's door downstairs one afternoon and asked politely if he'd been talking late at night, near the vents. He looked confused and told me no. He worked nights and didn't usually get home until after 3 a.m. That didn't explain what I'd been hearing. I didn't want to push, so I let it go and went back upstairs. That night, I listened again. The whispers returned, as soft and persistent as ever. This time I recorded them on my phone. The playback was even more chilling. There were no recognizable words, but the cadence was there, a slow, rhythmic pattern like chanting or breathing. The next morning I played the recording for a friend. He listened quietly and then asked, "Is someone saying your name?" I hadn't noticed it before, but once he said it, I couldn't unhear it. In the middle of the whispers, there was a distinct moment where my name seemed to emerge, drawn out and hushed, like someone exhaling it through clenched teeth. That was the moment the voice in the vent stopped feeling like background noise and started feeling like a message, a directed, deliberate call from somewhere deeper than the apartment could possibly allow. I didn't sleep that night. I tried blocking the vent, taped it shut, stacked furniture in front of it, but none of it helped. The voice still came, even louder, like it was angry at being muffled. One night, I awoke to the sound of metal scraping, sharp, unnatural, like something clawing at the inside of the vent cover. I turned on every light in the apartment and sat in the kitchen, too shaken to even pretend to sleep. When I checked the vent the next morning, the cover had been dislodged, bent outward, and there were faint, oily fingerprints on the metal, smeared like something had tried to crawl out. I contacted maintenance. They came to inspect the vent system, expecting to find an animal or a structural problem. They didn't find anything. No signs of rodents. No broken ducts. Could have been old pressure buildup, the guy said with a shrug, but his voice lacked conviction. He kept glancing back at the vent as he packed up his tools. I asked if anyone had reported anything similar. He paused, then said, "Not really, but people don't usually stay long in this unit." That sent a chill down my spine. Something about the way he said it, the slight hesitation, told me he knew more than he was saying. I started doing my own research. Looked into the history of the building. Nothing dramatic, no fires, no known crimes, but I found a small note buried in a forum post from years ago. Apartment 203. Weird stuff in the vents. Don't stay long. That was my unit. The realization hit hard. Whatever this was, it had been going on for a long time. I couldn't help but wonder how many people had heard the voice before me, how many ignored it, and how many listened too closely. I started keeping a journal of every incident, trying to find patterns. But the more I wrote, the less I felt like the voice was coming from the vent, and the more I felt like it was coming for me. The final night, I made the mistake of answering. The whispering had grown louder, angrier. I was exhausted, on edge, desperate. I leaned in close to the vent and whispered back, "What do you want?" There was silence. A pause that stretched far too long. Then, very clearly, a single word echoed out. "In." Just that, "in." I don't know what it meant. I don't want to know. But the wall around the vent cracked that night. A long, deep fracture that hadn't been there before, spreading out like veins from the center. Something had responded. And I realized I had let it know I was listening. Worse, I had invited it to speak. I left the next morning. Didn't wait for the lease to end. Didn't pack much. Just walked out and didn't look back. I'm in a different place now. New construction. No vents in the bedroom. But even now, late at night, I sometimes wake up to a faint sound, like breath against the walls. And I wonder, once you hear the voice, once you engage with it, does it ever really go away? Or does it follow, waiting patiently for another vent, another wall, another opening, so it can find its way back in?